The widow stood at the train station, clutching a single letter that promised her a husband she'd never met. When the stranger stepped onto the platform in clothes more holes than fabric, the crowd gasped. But Margaret Ellison didn't flinch. She'd gambled everything on this moment. Her ranch, her reputation, her last shred of hope. What she didn't know was that the man in rags carried something far more valuable than gold. Stay with me until the end of this story, and comment which city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale has traveled. The winter of 1882 settled over the Nebraska prairie like a cold, unforgiving hand. Snow didn't fall gently here. It came in sideways, driven by winds that howled across the flatlands with nothing to slow them down. The Ellison Ranch sat in the middle of this vast emptiness, a cluster of weathered buildings that looked like they were barely holding on against the elements. Margaret Ellison stood at her kitchen window, watching the sun struggle to break through the gray morning sky. She was 34 years old, though the past 2 years had added lines around her eyes that made her look older. Her hands, wrapped around a tin cup of weak coffee, bore the calluses and scars of hard work. She'd been beautiful once. Everyone said so, with auburn hair that caught the light and green eyes that sparkled when she laughed. But beauty seemed like a luxury from another lifetime now. The coffee had gone cold. She set it down and pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The kitchen was the warmest room in the house, but even here, frost crept along the edges of the windows. The fire in the stove needed more wood, but she'd been rationing the supply, making it stretch as far as possible. Her late husband, Thomas, had always kept 3 cords of wood stacked and ready for winter. Thomas had kept a lot of things running smoothly. The fences mended, the barn roof patched, the cattle fed and watered. He'd been a quiet man, not given to grand gestures or flowery words, but his presence had been solid, dependable. You could build a life on a foundation like that. Then came the accident. Margaret closed her eyes, but that didn't stop the memory. Thomas beneath the overturned wagon, his leg crushed, his face pale as paper. The 3-hour ride to town with him moaning in the back. The doctor's grim face, the infection that came despite everything, the fever, the delirium, the silence that followed. She opened her eyes and forced herself to look at the ranch yard. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges, banging in the wind. The chicken coop needed repairs before the predators found every gap. The north fence line had at least 20 posts that needed replacing, and beyond all that, the cattle. 40 head that somehow had to make it through the winter on feed she could barely afford. The bank's letter sat on the kitchen table, its sharp black type like a death sentence. Final notice. Payment due within 60 days or foreclosure proceedings will begin. Margaret had read it so many times she'd memorized every word. 60 days. She had 60 days to come up with $300, a sum that might as well have been $3,000. She'd sold everything she could spare. The good china, gone. Thomas's pocket watch, gone. The silver service her mother had given her, gone. She'd even sold her wedding ring, though that had nearly broken her. But it wasn't enough. It was never enough. She picked up the newspaper that lay beside the bank's letter. The Western Pioneer, 3 weeks old now, brought by the mail coach from Lincoln. She'd circled one advertisement in pencil, then erased it, then circled it again. She must have read it 100 times. Wanted. Honest men willing to work. Western widows and spinsters seek hard-working husbands. Must be sober, industrious, and of good moral character. Land and home provided. Reply to Mrs. Helena Bradshaw, Matrimonial Correspondence Society, Denver, Colorado. A mail-order husband. The words felt absurd even thinking them. Margaret had married for love the first time, or at least for affection and respect, which had grown into something deeper over the years. The idea of advertising for a man like he was livestock, or a piece of farm equipment seemed almost obscene. But what choice did she have? She couldn't run this ranch alone. She'd tried for 2 years, and every day she fell further behind. Her neighbors helped when they could, but they had their own land to worry about. Sam Pritchard had offered to buy her out twice now, each time with that oily smile that said he expected her to fail. The amount he'd offered was insulting, less than half what the land was worth. Margaret wasn't about to hand her home to Sam Pritchard. She sat down at the table and pulled out a sheet of paper, a pen, and the ink pot. For a long moment, she just stared at the blank page. What did you say to a stranger you were asking to marry you? How did you explain that you weren't looking for romance or companionship, just survival? She began to write. Dear Sir, my name is Margaret Ellison. I am a widow of 34 years, owner of a cattle ranch in Red Creek, Nebraska. I am seeking a husband not for affection, but for practical partnership. The work is hard, the winter's harsh, and the reward's uncertain. I can offer a roof, meals, and a share in whatever profit the land yields. I ask in return for honest labor, basic competence with livestock and repairs, and a willingness to endure silence when words serve no purpose. If you are a drinking man, a gambling man, or a man who raises his hand in anger, do not reply. If you seek easy wealth or comfort, look elsewhere. But if you are willing to work until your hands bleed for something that might become yours in time, then perhaps we can help each other survive. Respectfully, Margaret Ellison, Red Creek, Nebraska. She read it over 3 times, each time tempted to tear it up. It was too cold, too harsh, too businesslike. But anything softer felt like a lie, and Margaret was done with lies. The one she told herself most of all. She folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and addressed it to the Matrimonial Correspondence Society. The mail coach would come through Red Creek in 3 days. If she gave it to the driver then, the letter would reach Denver in a week, maybe less. She could still change her mind. She could burn the letter and figure out another way. She could... No. There was no other way. She'd exhausted every option, chased down every possibility. This was all she had left. Margaret stood and tucked the letter into her coat pocket. Then she pulled on her boots, wrapped a heavy scarf around her neck, and stepped out into the bitter cold. The wind hit her like a fist, stealing her breath. She bent into it and made her way across the yard to the barn. The animals needed feeding, and the work wouldn't wait for her fears or her pride. The barn was dark and musty, smelling of hay and manure and old leather. Margaret's mare, Clover, nickered softly from her stall. The 2 milk cows stood placidly chewing their cud. Up in the loft, the barn cats watched her with their unblinking yellow eyes. She forked hay into the mangers, her movements automatic after years of repetition. Thomas had taught her this work when they'd first married, back when she'd been a girl from town who didn't know one end of a pitchfork from the other. You'll learn, he'd said in that patient way of his. Ranching's not complicated, it's just hard. He'd been right about that. When the animals were fed, Margaret climbed up to the loft to check the hay supply. Her heart sank as she counted the bales. Maybe enough to last until March if she was careful. If the winter stretched longer, and it often did, she'd be buying feed at prices she couldn't afford. She sat on a hay bale and let herself rest for a moment. Up here, the wind sounded distant, almost soothing. Dust motes drifted through the thin beams of light that squeezed through the gaps in the walls. For just a moment, she could pretend everything was fine, that Thomas would come through the barn door any minute, that the bank wasn't circling like a vulture, that she wasn't about to mail a letter asking a stranger to marry her. But pretending didn't fix fences or feed cattle. She climbed back down and was heading for the barn door when she heard it, the sound of splintering wood, followed by angry bellowing. Margaret ran. In the south paddock, one of her bulls had broken through the fence and was now tangled in the barbed wire, thrashing and bleeding. The more he struggled, the deeper the wire cut into his hide. Easy, easy, boy. Margaret approached slowly, hands raised, voice low and steady despite the panic rising in her chest. The bull was worth at least $50, money she desperately needed. If he injured himself badly, if infection set in. The bull tossed his head and bellowed again, eyes rolling white with fear. Margaret grabbed a post that was still standing and used it to brace herself as she reached for the wire. The barbs bit into her gloves, but she ignored them, focused on loosening the loops around the bull's legs. Come on, she muttered through gritted teeth. The wire finally gave way. The bull lurched free and stumbled back, blood running down his legs in dark rivulets. Margaret checked him over quickly. The cuts weren't as deep as she'd feared, but they needed cleaning before infection could take hold. The fence, though, the fence was a disaster. 20 feet of wire down, posts snapped like matchsticks. It would take her at least a full day to repair, maybe 2. Time she didn't have. Materials she couldn't afford. Margaret stood there in the snow, looking at the wreckage, and felt something inside her crack, not break. She was too stubborn for that. But crack, like ice forming on still water. She was so tired, tired of fighting, tired of struggling, tired of facing every problem alone with nothing but her own two hands and a dwindling pile of resources. For just a moment, she let herself imagine what it would be like to have help. Real help. Someone to share the burden, to fix what broke, to stand beside her against the endless work and the harsh seasons and the weight of it all. She pulled the letter from her pocket and looked at it. The envelope was crisp and white against her work-worn glove. 60 days. She had 60 days to save her home. She needed a miracle, or at least she needed someone willing to work hard enough to look like one. 3 days later, Margaret stood at the Red Creek General Store, the letter still in her pocket. The mail coach was due in an hour, and she'd come to town under the pretense of buying supplies. In reality, she'd been arguing with herself for 3 days straight about whether to actually mail the damn thing. Red Creek wasn't much of a town, just a main street with a handful of buildings, a church, a saloon, and about 200 people who all knew each other's business far too well. Margaret could feel the eyes on her as she walked from the store to the post office. Widow Ellison, they'd be thinking. Poor thing, struggling alone out there. Wonder how long before she has to sell. The postmaster, Jonas Garrett, looked up when she entered. He was a thin man with wire spectacles and a habit of pursing his lips when he was thinking, which made him look like he was perpetually tasting something sour. "Mrs. Ellison," he said with a nod. "Letter to post?" Margaret's hand tightened on the envelope. This was it. Once she handed it over, there was no taking it back. The whole town would know eventually. Jonas wasn't much for discretion, and the address alone would spark gossip that would spread like wildfire. But what did her pride matter compared to losing everything? She held out the letter. "To Denver, please." Jonas took it, glanced at the address, and his eyebrows climbed toward his hairline. "Matrimonial Correspondence Society, eh?" His lips pursed. "Didn't know you were looking to remarry, Mrs. Ellison." "I'm looking to keep my ranch," Margaret said flatly. "If that requires a husband, so be it." Jonas had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. Course. Practical thinking, that. Postage is 5 cents. Margaret counted out the coins, money she could barely spare, and slid them across the counter. Jonas stamped the letter with more force than necessary and tossed it into the outgoing mailbag. "Coach will take it to Lincoln, then on to Denver," he said. "Should arrive in about a week, give or take. If someone replies, figure another week or two for the return." "Thank you, Jonas." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her at the door. "Mrs. Ellison, I hope you find what you're looking for. Thomas was a good man. You deserve someone decent." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She stepped out into the cold afternoon, feeling strangely hollow. She'd done it. For better or worse, she'd thrown her lot in with chance and desperation. Now, all she could do was wait. The weeks that followed were some of the longest of Margaret's life. Every day she worked from sunup to sundown, feeding animals, hauling water, chopping wood, mending what she could with increasingly inadequate supplies. Every night she collapsed into bed exhausted, only to lie awake wondering if anyone would reply, and if they did, what kind of man would answer an advertisement like hers. She imagined the worst, a drunkard looking for a roof and free meals, a con man seeking to steal what little she had, a brute who saw a lone woman as easy prey. The possibilities kept her up at night, staring at the ceiling, questioning her own judgment. But then she'd think of the bank's letter, still sitting on her kitchen table like a ticking clock. 43 days left. 42. 41. On the 38th day, Jonas Garrett's son rode out to the ranch with the letter. Margaret's hand shook as she took it. The return address was Denver, and the handwriting was blocky and precise, like someone who'd learned to write late in life but took great care with it. She gave the boy a penny for his trouble and waited until he'd ridden off before she opened it. "Dear Mrs. Ellison, my name is Caleb Ward. I am 38 years old, formerly of Ohio, though I have spent the last 15 years moving west. I served in the war and have worked as a farmhand, ranch hand, carpenter, and general laborer. I do not drink beyond an occasional beer. I do not gamble. I have never raised my hand to woman or child. I am not a man of means or education. I can read and write adequately, work with my hands competently, and endure hardship without complaint. What you described in your letter, hard work, harsh winters, uncertain rewards, describes most of my life. I am accustomed to it. I do not seek romance or comfort. I seek purpose and a place to belong. If you will have me, I will work for you honestly and to the best of my ability. I ask only for fair treatment and a chance to prove my worth. If these terms are acceptable, send word and I will come on the next train. Respectfully, Caleb Ward. Margaret read the letter 3 times, searching for hidden meanings or warning signs. The tone was straightforward, almost blunt. No flowery promises, no false charm, just a simple statement of qualifications and intentions. I seek purpose and a place to belong. Those words struck her hard. She understood that need more than she cared to admit. She'd felt unmoored since Thomas died, like she was barely keeping her head above water, struggling without direction or hope. Maybe this Caleb Ward felt the same. She sat down at her kitchen table and wrote a reply. Mr. Ward, your letter was received and your terms are acceptable. The next train arrives in Red Creek on Saturday, March 12th at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I will meet you at the station. Bring whatever possessions you have and expect to work immediately. The situation here is urgent. M. Ellison. She posted the letter that same day. If he left Denver promptly, he'd arrive in 10 days. 10 days until a stranger became her husband. 10 days until her gamble either saved her or made everything worse. Margaret returned to the ranch and threw herself into work, trying not to count down the hours. She cleaned the spare bedroom that had been gathering dust since Thomas died. She mended the curtains and aired out the mattress. She told herself she was just being practical, preparing for a hired hand who happened to come with a marriage certificate attached. But late at night, when the wind howled around the house and the darkness pressed close, she wondered what kind of man would answer an advertisement like hers. What kind of desperation drove someone to accept a marriage proposal from a stranger, sight unseen, with nothing promised but hard work and slim chances? And deeper still, beneath all her practical concerns and rational fears, a small voice whispered, "What if he's kind? What if he's decent? What if, against all odds, this actually works?" She silenced that voice quickly. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. Better to expect nothing and be pleasantly surprised than to hope and be crushed. March 12th arrived gray and cold, with a bitter wind that cut through even the thickest coat. Margaret dressed carefully that morning, choosing her least worn dress, a simple blue cotton that had once been her church dress, and pinning her hair up neatly. She told herself it didn't matter what she looked like, that this was a business arrangement, but some stubborn part of her refused to meet her future husband looking like a scarecrow. She hitched Clover to the small wagon and made the hour-long journey into Red Creek. The town was busier than usual. Saturday was market day, and farmers from the surrounding ranches had come in to trade and socialize. Margaret felt their eyes on her as she drove past, and she knew they were all wondering the same thing. Had the widow Ellison really sent for a mail-order husband? Let them wonder. Let them gossip. She'd weathered worse than wagging tongues. She tied Clover near the train station and stood on the platform watching the eastern horizon. The train was due at 2 o'clock. It was 10 minutes past 1. Time crawled. Other people gathered on the platform, families waiting for relatives, merchants expecting shipments, young couples courting under the watchful eyes of chaperones. Margaret stood apart from them, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, trying to quiet the nervous flutter in her stomach. What if he didn't come? What if he'd changed his mind? What if he did come? At precisely 2 o'clock, the train's whistle pierced the air. Margaret's heart jumped into her throat. The great iron beast came rumbling into the station, brakes squealing, steam hissing, like something from a fevered dream. Passengers began to disembark. A well-dressed family, a traveling salesman with a heavy case, 2 cowboys heading west to find work, an older woman clutching a carpet bag. And then she saw him. He was tall, at least 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a lean build that spoke of hard work and lean times. His dark hair needed cutting, hanging past his collar in shaggy waves. He wore a coat that had seen better days, patched at the elbows and frayed at the hem. His trousers were stained and mended. His boots were held together with twine. But it was his face that caught Margaret's attention, weathered and lined with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' worth of stubble. His eyes, dark and cautious, scanned the platform with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to expect much from the world. Those eyes found hers and held. Margaret forced herself to step forward. "Mr. Ward?" He removed his hat, a gesture of respect that revealed more fully a face marked by sun and hardship. "Mrs. Ellison?" His voice was low and rough, like stones tumbling in a creek bed. They stood there for a moment, sizing each other up. Around them, the platform buzzed with activity, but it all seemed distant, muffled. Margaret was acutely aware of the whispers starting up, the sidelong glances, the naked curiosity of her neighbors. Caleb Ward carried a single battered rucksack. That was it. Everything he owned in the world apparently contained in one small bag. "Is that all your belongings?" Margaret asked, trying to keep the surprise from her voice. "Yes, ma'am. Never saw the point in collecting what I'd only have to leave behind." He glanced around the platform, then back at her. "I'm ready to work whenever you need me. Right now, if you're able. Daylight's burning and there's a fence that needs mending before nightfall." Something that might have been approval flickered across his face. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret led him to the wagon, conscious of every eye following them. She could practically hear the gossip starting. "Did you see him? Looks like he's been sleeping rough. Wore rags, practically." What was she thinking? She helped him load his rucksack into the wagon bed, then climbed up onto the seat. He hesitated for just a moment before climbing up beside her. She noticed he was careful to keep a respectful distance between them. She clicked her tongue at Clover, and the wagon lurched forward. They rode in silence for the first 10 minutes, the only sounds the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft plod of Clover's hooves. Margaret kept her eyes on the road, but she was hyper-aware of the man beside her, the way he sat straight despite his obvious exhaustion, the way his eyes cataloged everything they passed, the way his hands rested on his knees with a stillness that spoke of discipline. Finally, she broke the silence. "I should explain the situation plainly, Mr. Ward. The ranch is failing. My late husband died 2 years ago, and I've been trying to manage alone. I've fallen behind on everything: maintenance, feed, payments. The bank is threatening foreclosure in less than 30 days. Understood. I need help, real help, not half-hearted assistance or promises that evaporate when the work gets hard. I need someone who can fix what's broken, work long hours, and not complain about the conditions. I can do that. There's no money for wages. Whatever the ranch produces, we split. If it fails, we both lose everything." Fair enough. His responses were so brief, so matter-of-fact that Margaret couldn't quite read him. Was he truly unafraid or just resigned? Did he understand what he was getting into? "Why did you answer my advertisement, Mr. Ward?" That made him pause. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer at all. Finally, he said, "I've been drifting for 15 years, ma'am. Working other people's land, sleeping in other people's barns, moving on when the season ends or the work dries up. I'm tired of drifting. I'm tired of belonging nowhere." He glanced at her, and she saw something raw in his expression. "You offered a place to belong. That's worth more than wages to me." Margaret felt something in her chest tighten. She understood that exhaustion, that bone-deep weariness that came from fighting alone for too long. "The marriage," she said carefully. "It's a legal necessity, a formality. I don't expect, that is, I'm not looking for—" "I understand, ma'am. You need a partner for the work, not the bed. I'm fine with that arrangement." The bluntness should have embarrassed her, but instead it was almost a relief. At least they both knew where they stood. The ranch came into view, the weathered buildings, the sagging fences, the fields covered in patchy snow. In the late afternoon light, it looked even more run down than usual. Margaret saw it through his eyes and felt a stab of shame. "It's not much," she said quietly. "It's more than I had this morning," Caleb replied, "and more than most have in this world." They pulled into the yard. Clover knew the way home and headed straight for the barn. Margaret climbed down, and Caleb followed, slinging his rucksack over his shoulder. "I'll show you where you'll sleep," she said. "Then we need to work on that fence before it gets dark." She led him into the house. It was cold inside. She'd let the fire die down before leaving for town. She'd light it again later. Right now, there wasn't time. She showed him the spare bedroom. It was small and sparse, just a bed, a dresser, and a washstand. It's not much, but it's clean and the roof doesn't leak. Much. Caleb set his rucksack on the bed. It's fine, ma'am. Better than I'm used to. There's water in the kitchen if you need to wash up, but like I said, the fence can't wait. He nodded and followed her back outside. The damaged fence was in the south paddock, still in the same state of disrepair it had been in for days. Margaret had managed to rig a temporary barrier to keep the cattle in, but it wouldn't hold much longer. She gathered tools from the barn: a post hole digger, wire cutters, new fencing wire, replacement posts. When she turned around, Caleb had already removed his coat and was examining the damage, his trained eye assessing what needed to be done. Posts snapped clean through, he said. Ground's probably been freezing and thawing, weakening the wood. We'll need to dig down at least 2 feet for the new posts, maybe 2.5. Margaret handed him the post hole digger. Then we'd better get started. They worked until the sun sank below the horizon and the temperature dropped even further. Margaret held the post steady while Caleb dug, his movements efficient and tireless despite hours of travel. He didn't complain about the cold or the hard ground or his empty stomach. He just worked, steady and methodical, like a man who'd spent his whole life doing exactly this. When they finished stringing the new wire, full darkness had fallen. Margaret's hands were numb inside her gloves, and her shoulders ached from holding the posts. But the fence was sound. It would hold. That'll do for tonight, she said, her breath fogging in the cold air. Let's get inside before we freeze. In the kitchen, Margaret built up the fire while Caleb stood awkwardly near the door, as if unsure whether he was allowed to sit. She gestured to the table. Sit. I'll make supper. There wasn't much: salt pork, beans, and cornbread left over from breakfast. She heated it up and served it on 2 chipped plates. Caleb ate like a man who'd been hungry for a while, steady and focused, wasting nothing. They ate in silence. Margaret found herself stealing glances at him in the firelight. Now that they were indoors and she could see him clearly, she noticed details she'd missed before. The scar across his left eyebrow, the calluses on his hands, the way he held himself with the careful stillness of someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible. When they finished, he helped her wash the dishes without being asked. Another point in his favor. There's something we need to discuss, Margaret said as she dried the last plate. The marriage itself. We should do it soon. Legal protection, you understand. If the bank comes around, I need to be able to show that I have help, that the ranch has better prospects now. Caleb nodded. When? Tomorrow, if Pastor Matthews is available. It doesn't need to be a ceremony, just the legal documentation. Whatever you think is best, ma'am. She turned to face him fully. Mr. Ward, if we're going to be married, even in name only, you should probably call me Margaret. He met her eyes. Then you should call me Caleb. All right, Caleb. She paused. And thank you for coming, for working, for not asking questions or making demands. You gave me an honest deal, Margaret. That's more than most offer. I intend to honor my end of it. There was something in his voice, a quiet integrity that Margaret recognized because she'd heard it before, in Thomas's voice, in his promises. The sound of a man whose word actually meant something. She showed him to his room, gave him an extra blanket against the cold, and bid him good night. In her own room, she sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the floor, trying to process everything that had happened in a single day. She'd gambled on a stranger, on a man who'd arrived with nothing but the clothes on his back and a promise to work hard. It could still all fall apart. He could leave in the morning. The ranch could still fail. The bank could still take everything. But for the first time in months, Margaret felt something she'd almost forgotten. A tiny flicker of hope. Not certainty. Not confidence. Just the small, fragile possibility that maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to face the fight alone anymore. Outside her window, the wind howled across the prairie, indifferent and eternal. But inside the house, someone else was breathing. Another heart was beating. Another soul was choosing to stay and struggle alongside her. It wasn't love. It wasn't even friendship yet. But it was a start. And for Margaret Ellison, standing on the edge of losing everything, a start was more than she'd dared to hope for in a very long time. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Ellison ranch, painting the snow-covered prairie in shades of rose and gold. Margaret woke to the unfamiliar sound of someone moving around outside her window. For a confused moment, she thought Thomas had come back, that the past 2 years had been nothing but a terrible dream. Then reality settled over her like a weight, and she remembered Caleb Ward, the stranger who'd arrived yesterday in rags, the man who was about to become her husband. She dressed quickly in the frigid bedroom, her fingers clumsy with cold as she fastened buttons and pinned up her hair. When she emerged into the kitchen, she found the fire already burning hot in the stove, the coffee pot bubbling, and the smell of frying salt pork filling the air. Caleb stood at the stove, his back to her, still wearing yesterday's clothes. His dark hair was damp, as if he'd washed at the pump outside despite the freezing temperature. "You didn't need to do this," Margaret said. He turned, spatula in hand. "You worked as hard as I did yesterday. Seemed fair to start breakfast." He gestured to the table. "Coffee's ready." Margaret poured herself a cup and sat down, watching him work. He moved with the easy competence of someone who'd cooked for himself for years, flipping the meat, checking the cornmeal mush he'd made. When he served the plates, the portions were exactly equal. He hadn't taken more for himself despite his larger size. They ate in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't hostile either. Margaret found herself stealing glances at him, trying to reconcile the desperate advertisement she'd written with the reality of this quiet, careful man sitting across from her. "I'll ride into town this morning," she said finally. "Talk to Pastor Matthews about performing the ceremony. If you'd rather stay here and start on the other repairs—" "I'll come with you," Caleb interrupted. "It's my responsibility too." Something about the way he said it, straightforward, without resentment or reluctance, made Margaret's chest tighten. She nodded and finished her coffee. An hour later, they were on the wagon heading back to Red Creek. The morning sun had done little to warm the air, and their breath formed clouds between them. Margaret had chosen her best dress again, the blue cotton, and had noticed that Caleb had attempted to brush the worst of the trail dust from his clothes. It hadn't helped much. The coat was still patched, the trousers still stained. He looked like exactly what he was, a man who'd been living hand-to-mouth for years. Margaret felt a surge of defiance. Let the town talk. Let them judge. She'd done what she had to do to survive, and she wouldn't apologize for it. Red Creek came into view, and Margaret could already see the curious faces turning toward them as they drove down the main street. Mrs. Henderson stopped sweeping her porch to stare. The blacksmith paused mid-hammer-stroke. Even the dog seemed to watch them pass with unusual interest. "Small town," Caleb observed quietly. "Very small, and very interested in everyone else's business." Margaret kept her eyes forward, her spine straight. "They'll gossip no matter what we do. Might as well give them something worth talking about." The corner of Caleb's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. "Yes, ma'am." The church sat at the end of Main Street, a simple white building with a modest steeple. Pastor Matthews lived in the small house beside it, and Margaret could see smoke rising from his chimney. She tied Clover to the hitching post, and they walked up to the door together. Margaret knocked 3 times. After a moment, the door opened to reveal Pastor Matthews, a round man in his 50s with kind eyes and a permanently worried expression. He'd married Margaret and Thomas 12 years ago, and he'd presided over Thomas's funeral. Now he looked between Margaret and Caleb with poorly concealed surprise. "Mrs. Ellison, I wasn't expecting you this morning." "Pastor Matthews, this is Caleb Ward. We'd like you to perform a marriage ceremony today, if possible." The pastor's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline. "Today? Margaret, this seems rather sudden." "It's necessary," Margaret said firmly. "For the ranch. For legal reasons. We need it done quickly." Pastor Matthews' gaze shifted to Caleb, taking in the worn clothes and weathered face. Margaret could see him making calculations, drawing conclusions. She waited for the inevitable questions, the gentle suggestions that perhaps they should wait. Think it through, consider the implications. Instead, the pastor sighed. "Come inside. It's too cold to discuss this on the doorstep." They followed him into the small parlor. His wife, Ruth, appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her eyes widened when she saw Caleb, and Margaret watched the same evaluation happen, the quick assessment, the barely hidden concern. "Ruth, would you put on tea?" Pastor Matthews gestured for them to sit. "Margaret, Mr. Ward, please." They sat on the small sofa while the pastor settled into his chair. He steepled his fingers and studied them both with that penetrating look he probably thought was subtle. "Margaret," he said gently, "I've known you since you were a girl. I married you and Thomas. I know how hard these past 2 years have been. If you're doing this out of desperation—" "I am doing this out of desperation," Margaret interrupted. "I'm 34 days away from losing everything Thomas and I built. I need help, Pastor. Real help. Mr. Ward has agreed to work the ranch in exchange for a share in whatever it produces. Marriage is the most practical way to formalize that arrangement." "Marriage is a sacred covenant before God," Pastor Matthews said. "Not a business contract. Then it can be both." Margaret leaned forward. "Pastor, I'm not asking for your approval. I'm asking for your service. Will you marry us or not?" The room fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock. Ruth returned with a tea tray, the cups rattling slightly in the quiet. She poured for everyone, her movements careful and deliberate. Caleb, who'd been silent through the entire exchange, finally spoke. "Pastor Matthews, I understand your concern. You don't know me. You're worried I might be taking advantage of Mrs. Ellison's situation." He accepted a cup of tea with a nod of thanks to Ruth. "I can't prove my character with words, only with time and action. But I can tell you this. I've never broken a promise in my life, and I don't intend to start now. Mrs. Ellison offered me honest terms. I accepted them honestly. That's the extent of it." Something in his voice, that same quiet integrity Margaret had heard the night before, seemed to reach the pastor. Matthews was silent for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, I'll perform the ceremony, but I want you both to understand what you're entering into. Marriage, even a practical one, binds you legally and spiritually. It's not something to be undone lightly." "I understand," Margaret said. "I understand," Caleb echoed. Pastor Matthews rose and retrieved his Bible and the marriage register from his study. Ruth gathered some wildflowers from the vase on the windowsill and fashioned them into a small bouquet, pressing them into Margaret's hands with a sad smile. "Every bride should have flowers," she whispered. They stood before the fireplace, Margaret and Caleb side by side with barely an inch between them. Pastor Matthews opened his Bible, and Ruth stood as witness, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Dearly beloved," the pastor began, his voice falling into the familiar cadence of the ceremony, "we are gathered here today." Margaret barely heard the words. She was too aware of Caleb standing beside her, solid and still as a fence post. Too aware of how strange this was, how different from her first wedding when she'd been young and nervous and genuinely in love. That ceremony had been full of family and friends, laughter and tears, a celebration of two lives joining together. This was something else entirely. A transaction. A survival strategy. A desperate gamble wrapped in sacred words. "Do you, Margaret Ann Ellison, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Margaret looked at Caleb. His dark eyes met hers, steady and calm. Whatever happened next, they'd face it together. That was the deal. "I do," she said. "Do you, Caleb James Ward, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" "I do," Caleb said, his voice rough but certain. "The ring?" Pastor Matthews asked. Margaret hadn't thought about rings. She'd sold her first wedding ring months ago. But Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple band of twisted silver wire. It was crude, clearly handmade, but there was something beautiful in its simplicity. "Made it last night," he said quietly, taking Margaret's hand. His fingers were warm despite the cold morning, calloused and strong. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Nebraska and Almighty God, I now pronounce you husband and wife." Pastor Matthews closed his Bible. "You may kiss the bride." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Caleb leaned down and pressed a brief, chaste kiss to Margaret's cheek. Respectful, appropriate, completely, without passion. It was exactly what their arrangement called for, and yet Margaret felt an unexpected pang of something she couldn't quite name. Ruth cried openly now, hugging them both. Congratulations. I hope you'll be very happy together. Pastor Matthews had them sign the register, his pen scratching across the page with official finality. Caleb Ward and Margaret Ellison Ward. It was done. They paid the pastor, $2 Margaret could barely afford but that custom demanded, and walked back out into the cold morning. As they climbed into the wagon, Margaret caught sight of several townspeople watching from across the street. The whispers would be flying by noon. Well, Margaret said as they headed out of town, I suppose that makes it official. I suppose it does. Caleb glanced at the silver ring on her finger. I hope the ring's acceptable. I know it's not much. It's fine. Margaret touched it with her other hand, feeling the rough texture of the twisted wire. Better than fine. Thank you for thinking of it. They rode in silence for a while, the landscape rolling past them in shades of white and brown. Margaret tried to process what had just happened. She was married again. To a man she'd known for less than 24 hours. A man who was now legally entitled to everything she had, which wasn't much, but still. She glanced at him from the corner of her eye. He sat easily on the wagon seat, one hand resting on his knee, his attention on the road ahead. There was something peaceful about him, she realized. Despite his obvious poverty and hard past, he didn't carry the bitterness or anger she might have expected. He just seemed steady, accepting of whatever came. Can I ask you something? Margaret said. Of course. Your letter said you served in the war. Which side? A shadow passed across his face. Union, Ohio Regiment. I was 16 when I enlisted, lied about my age. He paused. 4 years of fighting, saw things no one should see, did things I'm not proud of. Most soldiers did, Margaret said quietly. Thomas served too, Confederate, though he never talked about it much. I think the memories haunted him. They have a way of doing that. Caleb was quiet for a moment. After the war, I tried to go home, but home wasn't there anymore. Parents dead, farm sold off. My brother had moved west and I never found him, so I just kept moving. Figured I'd find a place eventually where I fit. 15 years later, still looking. Maybe you found it, Margaret said. Maybe. He looked at her then, really looked at her. Or maybe I'm about to help you lose everything you've worked for. Either way, I'll do my best to make sure it's not for lack of trying. They arrived back at the ranch just after noon. The animals needed tending, and there was a list of repairs a mile long waiting for them. But first, Margaret made a simple lunch, bread, cheese, and apples. And they sat at the kitchen table like the married couple they now legally were. I need to check the north fence line this afternoon, Margaret said. It's been weeks since I've been up there, and I'm worried about breaks. If the cattle get through, we could lose half the herd before we even know they're gone. I'll come with you, Caleb said. You shouldn't be riding fence alone. It was such a simple statement, but it hit Margaret hard. For 2 years, she'd ridden fence alone, hauled water alone, fixed brakes alone, made every decision alone. The weight of that solitude had become so familiar, she'd almost stopped noticing it. Almost. They saddled 2 horses, Clover for Margaret and an aging gelding named Buck for Caleb, and rode out across the snow-patched prairie. The north fence line ran for nearly 2 miles, following the property boundary along a shallow creek bed. It was rough country, dotted with scrub brush and rocky outcroppings where fence posts had to be wedged into grudging soil. They rode side by side, their horses picking their way carefully over the uneven ground. Margaret pointed out landmarks, the lightning-struck cottonwood that marked the northeast corner, the old buffalo wallow that filled with water in spring, the cluster of rocks where rattlesnakes liked to sun themselves in summer. Caleb absorbed it all silently, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape, cataloging information. She could see him building a mental map of the property, noting every detail that might matter later. The fence was worse than Margaret had feared. In 3 separate places, posts had rotted through and the wire sagged to the ground. In one spot, cattle had clearly pushed through. Hoofprints and torn grass marked their passage. How many head are you missing? Caleb asked, studying the tracks. I won't know until we do a full count, but it could be 5 or 6, maybe more. Each lost cow represented money she desperately needed. Margaret felt the familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. Caleb dismounted and examined the broken posts. "We'll need to come back with materials. These need replacing, not patching. And we should string an extra line of wire along the bottom. The ground's too uneven here. Cattle can get under if they try hard enough." "That's more wire than I can afford right now," Margaret admitted. "Then we make do with what we have and prioritize the worst sections." He straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. "One step at a time. We can't fix everything at once, but we can keep it from getting worse." They continued along the fence line, marking problem areas in Margaret's mind for later attention. The sun hung low in the western sky by the time they made it back to the ranch, their faces wind-burned and their bodies tired. But the animals still needed evening feeding, the eggs still needed collecting, and the firewood still needed chopping. Ranch work didn't stop just because you were exhausted. Margaret started on the barn chores while Caleb tackled the woodpile. Through the open barn door, she could hear the rhythmic thunk of the axe biting into wood. The sound was oddly comforting, proof that someone else was sharing the burden, that she wasn't carrying it all alone. By the time she finished with the animals and collected the eggs, darkness had fallen and the temperature had dropped below freezing. She found Caleb stacking split wood in the shelter beside the house, a pile that would have taken her 2 days to cut already neatly arranged. "That's enough for tonight," she called. "Come inside before you freeze." He buried the axe in the chopping block and followed her in. The kitchen was warm from the stove, and Margaret had put on beans to simmer with the last of the salt pork. She sliced bread while Caleb washed up at the basin, his hands red from the cold and the work. They ate dinner in a silence that was gradually becoming familiar. Not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with all the things they weren't saying. Questions about who they really were, what they wanted, whether this desperate arrangement could possibly work. After dinner, as they cleaned up together, a routine already forming, Margaret found herself speaking without quite meaning to. "I need to tell you about the bank." Caleb paused in drying a plate. "All right." "The loan is $300. It's secured against the property, which means we can't pay, they'll take everything. The land, the buildings, the livestock, all of it." She scrubbed at a pot with more force than necessary. "I've been trying to save enough from selling cattle, but feed costs are high, and I lost animals over the winter. I'm short by at least $100, maybe more. How much time do we have?" 33 days. Caleb was quiet, thinking. "Can you sell more cattle?" "Not without weakening the herd to the point where we can't rebuild. I need to keep the breeding stock if we're going to have any chance of making it through next year." "Other assets, equipment, land you could lease?" Margaret shook her head. "I've sold everything I can spare. There's nothing left except what we need to operate." The weight of it settled between them. 33 days to come up with $100. A fortune for people in their position. Margaret had been carrying this knowledge alone for so long that saying it out loud almost made it worse. "We'll figure something out," Caleb said finally. "People with their backs against the wall tend to find solutions they wouldn't have thought of otherwise." "You say that like you've been there before." "Many times." He hung the dish towel carefully on its hook. "After the war, I worked on a farm in Indiana. Owner died, and his widow was about to lose everything to creditors. We worked 16-hour days for 3 months straight, sold everything we could think of, took on extra jobs in town. We saved the farm." He paused. "I moved on a year later, but last I heard she was still there, still making it work." "What did you do? To earn the extra money?" "Whatever needed doing. Cut wood, hauled freight, built fences for neighbors. Anything that paid." Margaret felt something kindle in her chest. Not hope, exactly, but something close to it. Red Creek isn't a big town, but there's usually work available. The blacksmith is always behind on orders. Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house is getting too old to chop her own wood. And spring planting season is coming. Farmers might need extra hands. Then we work the ranch by day and take jobs in town whenever we can. Caleb met her eyes. We don't quit. We don't give up. We fight for every dollar until we have enough. The simplicity of it, the absolute conviction in his voice, made Margaret want to believe it could work. She was so tired of fighting alone, so tired of having no one to share the burden or the decisions or the fear that gnawed at her in the dark hours before dawn. "Why are you doing this?" The question escaped before she could stop it. "You could walk away tomorrow. You owe me nothing. You could find work anywhere, some situation less desperate than this. Why stay? Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and in his dark eyes she saw something that might have been understanding or recognition or simply the acknowledgement of a shared truth. Because I'm tired of walking away, he said quietly. I've spent 15 years moving on whenever things got hard, whenever I felt like I didn't belong. I'm done running. You offered me a chance to stand and fight for something, to build something instead of just maintaining someone else's work. Maybe we fail. Maybe the bank takes everything and we end up with nothing. But at least we'll have tried. At least we'll have stood our ground. He paused. And you kept your word. You said the work would be hard and the rewards uncertain, and you were honest about it. That's rare enough to be worth fighting for. Margaret felt something shift inside her, some frozen part of her heart beginning to thaw. She'd approached this marriage as a transaction, a practical solution to an impossible problem. But standing in her kitchen with this man who'd arrived in rags and already worked harder than anyone had a right to expect, she realized it might become something more. Not love. That was too much to hope for. But partnership, genuine partnership. Two people standing together against whatever came. Thank you, she said. For staying, for trying, for understanding what this is and not asking for it to be something else. Thank you for giving me the chance. He glanced toward the window, where frost was already forming on the glass. I should let you get some sleep. Morning comes early. They parted at the hallway, each heading to their separate rooms. Margaret changed into her nightgown and crawled under the quilts, but sleep was a long time coming. She lay in the darkness, listening to the house settle around her, thinking about everything that had happened in just 2 days. She'd written a desperate letter to strangers. A man had answered. They'd married. And now they had 33 days to save everything. It should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something she'd almost forgotten. Determination mixed with possibility. The odds were still against them. The bank was still circling. The ranch was still falling apart faster than they could fix it. But she wasn't alone anymore. That made all the difference in the world. The next morning came cold and clear, and they fell into a rhythm that would define the weeks ahead. Up before dawn, quick breakfast, then splitting up to tackle the endless list of chores. Margaret handled the animals while Caleb worked on repairs, patching the barn roof, replacing rotted fence posts, fixing the gate that had been hanging crooked for months. By mid-morning, they'd reunite to work on larger projects together. The north fence line, the water trough that had cracked over winter, the chicken coop that needed reinforcing against predators. They worked side by side, mostly in silence, speaking only when necessary to coordinate their efforts. Caleb had a gift for fixing things, Margaret noticed. He could look at a problem, a broken hinge, a sagging beam, a gate that wouldn't close, and immediately see the solution. His hands were skilled despite their roughness, capable of delicate adjustments as easily as brute force. And he wasted nothing. Every scrap of wood, every bent nail straightened, every piece of wire saved for reuse. On the third day, they rode into town together. Margaret stopped at the general store to inquire about accounts she owed, while Caleb went to see the blacksmith about work. The store was run by Martin Palmer, a thin man with sharp eyes who kept mental tallies of every debt in Red Creek. He looked up when Margaret entered, his expression carefully neutral. Mrs. Ellison, or should I say Mrs. Ward, now. Heard you got married. Quick work, that. Mr. Palmer, Margaret kept her voice level. I wanted to discuss my account. Yes, your account. He pulled out a leather-bound ledger and flipped through the pages. Let's see. You're currently $14.30 in arrears. Haven't made a payment in 2 months. Margaret had known it was bad, but hearing the number spoken aloud still made her stomach clench. I'm aware. I'm working on getting current. I should be able to make a payment within the week. I hope so, Mrs. Ward. I've been patient, but patience has its limits. He looked at her over the rim of his spectacles. I heard your new husband arrived without a penny to his name. That true? My husband arrived ready to work, which is worth more than pennies. Work doesn't pay bills, Mrs. Ward. Money does. But he closed the ledger. 1 week. If I don't see payment by then, I'll have to start requiring cash for any purchases. Margaret left the store feeling the familiar weight of anxiety pressing down on her shoulders. $14. Just one of many debts she was juggling, and not even the largest. The bank loan dwarfed everything else. She found Caleb at the blacksmith shop, deep in conversation with Owen Davies, the smith himself. Owen was a massive man with arms like tree trunks and a personality as blunt as his hammers. "Mrs. Ellison, Ward, I should say." Owen wiped his soot-blackened hands on his apron. "Your husband here says he's got some experience with metalwork." "Enough to be useful," Caleb said. "Did some blacksmithing during the war, shoeing horses mainly, but I learned general forge work." Owen nodded slowly. "I could use an extra pair of hands, especially with spring coming. Farmers will be wanting plows sharpened, tools repaired, all manner of work. Can't promise regular hours, but when I need help, I'll send word. Pay is 50 cents a day." "I'll take it," Caleb said immediately. They shook hands, and Margaret felt a small measure of relief. 50 cents a day wasn't much, but it was something. Every little bit helped. As they headed back to the wagon, Margaret told him about her conversation with Palmer. Caleb's jaw tightened, but he just nodded. "Add it to the list. We'll tackle the debts one at a time, starting with the most urgent. The bank first, then Palmer, then everything else." Over the next week, a pattern emerged. They worked the ranch together until mid-afternoon, then one or both of them would head into town for paying work. Caleb spent 3 afternoons at the blacksmith shop, coming home exhausted and covered in soot but with $1.50 in his pocket. Margaret took in mending from Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house, sitting up late into the night by lamplight, her fingers cramping as she repaired sheets and shirts. They pooled every penny in a mason jar that sat on the kitchen shelf. Each night, they'd count it together, adding the day's earnings to the total. Watching the pile of coins grow became their evening ritual, a small measure of progress against the mountain of debt. On Sunday, they attended church together. It was Margaret's first time since Thomas's funeral, and she could feel every eye in the congregation tracking their entrance. Caleb wore his same patched clothes. He had nothing better, but he'd washed and shaved, and he carried himself with quiet dignity as they took a seat in the back pew. Pastor Matthew's sermon was about faith in difficult times, and Margaret wondered if he'd chosen the topic for their benefit. Afterward, several people approached to offer cautious congratulations, or thinly veiled curiosity disguised as concern. Mrs. Henderson, the boarding house owner, was more direct. "Margaret, dear, I do hope you know what you're doing. Marrying a stranger is risky business." "I'm surviving, Mrs. Henderson. That's what I'm doing." Margaret kept her voice polite but firm. "And if you have any more mending that needs doing, I'm still taking work." "As a matter of fact, I do." Mrs. Henderson's expression softened slightly. "I'll have my boy bring it by the ranch tomorrow." They were heading back to their wagon when Sam Pritchard intercepted them. Sam was a successful rancher who'd made his money through land speculation and what Margaret privately considered to be predatory business practices. He owned twice as much land as the Ellison Ranch and was always looking to expand. "Mrs. Ward," he said, tipping his expensive hat. "Heard you'd taken a husband. My congratulations." "Thank you, Mr. Pritchard." Margaret kept her hand on Caleb's arm, a subtle signal of unity. Sam's eyes traveled over Caleb with barely disguised assessment. "You're the fellow who came in on the train last week, from Denver, I heard." "That's right," Caleb said evenly. "Taking on the Ellison place is ambitious. Place has been struggling for a while now. Bank troubles, I understand." Sam's smile didn't reach his eyes. "If things don't work out, my offer still stands, Mrs. Ward. I'd be willing to take the property off your hands. Fair price, quick transaction. Save you a lot of trouble." "The ranch isn't for sale, Mr. Pritchard," Margaret said firmly. "It wasn't for sale before, and it isn't now." "Well, if circumstances change..." Sam tipped his hat again. "You know where to find me." They watched him walk away, his expensive boots clicking on the boardwalk. "Who is he?" Caleb asked quietly. "Trouble," Margaret replied. "He's been trying to buy my land since Thomas died. Gets more persistent every time I turn him down. I think he's hoping I'll fail so he can pick up the property for nothing at the foreclosure auction. Then we'll just have to make sure that doesn't happen." The simple determination in Caleb's voice steadied her. They climbed into the wagon and headed home, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders despite the lingering chill in the air. That night, Margaret sat at the kitchen table with her account book spread before her. She'd been avoiding this for weeks, not wanting to face the full scope of their financial disaster. But now, with Caleb's help, maybe she could finally see a path forward. Caleb sat across from her, the lamplight casting shadows across his weathered face. "Walk me through it," he said. "Everything we owe, everything we have, everything we might be able to sell or earn." Margaret took a deep breath and began. The bank loan was $300, due in 29 days. Her account at the general store was $14.30. She owed the feed store another $8. The property taxes were coming due in May, another $20. And there were smaller debts scattered around town, totaling maybe $5 or $6 more. So roughly $350 total, Caleb said, writing the numbers down on a scrap of paper. Difference. "All right," Caleb said finally. "What assets do we have? What can we sell?" They went through everything. The cattle, 40 head, but Margaret was adamant about keeping at least 30 for breeding stock. 10 head, at maybe $10 each, would give them $100. The horses, they needed at least 2, but they had 4. 2 could be sold for maybe $15 each. Farm equipment, household items, anything that wasn't absolutely essential. By the time they finished, they'd identified maybe $150 worth of sellable assets. Added to the $17 they already had, that would give them $167, still short by nearly $200. "We need to earn the rest," Caleb said. "Between now and the deadline, we work every job we can find, morning and night, ranch work in between. No rest, no breaks. We throw everything we have at this." Margaret looked at the numbers on the page, then at Caleb. He looked tired. The past week had been brutal, with long days and short nights. But his expression was determined. He wasn't giving up. He wasn't suggesting they quit or accept defeat or hand everything over to Sam Pritchard. He was ready to fight. "All right," Margaret said. "We fight, we sell what we can, work every job available, and hope it's enough." "It will be enough," Caleb said with conviction. "We'll make it enough." Over the following days, they began implementing their plan. Margaret made arrangements to sell 10 head of cattle to a buyer in Lincoln. It would take a week to finalize, but it would bring in $100. Caleb sold 2 horses to a farmer whose team had gone lame, getting $15 for each. Margaret took on more mending work, and Caleb picked up odd jobs around town, chopping wood, hauling freight, repairing fences for neighboring ranches. They worked until their hands bled and their bodies screamed for rest. They worked through rain and wind and cold. They worked when they were hungry because food cost money they couldn't spare. They worked when they were exhausted because stopping meant failing. And slowly, painfully, the pile of money in the mason jar grew. $20, $30, $50. Each coin represented hours of labor, sacrifice, determination. They counted it every night, adding the day's earnings to the total, measuring their progress against the deadline that crept closer with each passing day. But it wasn't just about the money. Something else was growing between them. Something neither of them had anticipated when they'd stood in Pastor Matthew's parlor and exchanged vows. They were becoming partners in the truest sense, 2 people working toward a common goal with absolute trust and commitment. They learned each other's rhythms, anticipated each other's needs, worked together with the smooth efficiency of a team that had been together for years rather than weeks. Late one night, after an especially brutal day, they sat at the kitchen table counting the day's earnings. Margaret's fingers were swollen from sewing, and Caleb's hands were blistered from wielding a hammer at the blacksmith shop all afternoon. The lamplight flickered between them. "We're at $132, Margaret said, adding the latest coins to the jar. "We're getting close." "Not close enough." "Not yet." But Caleb smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him. "But we're going to make it. I can feel it." Margaret found herself smiling back. Against all odds, against every reasonable expectation, they were going to save the ranch. And in the process, they were building something neither of them had expected, a real partnership, founded on mutual respect and shared struggle. A marriage that had started as a desperate transaction was becoming something genuine. The storm came without warning on a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after Caleb had arrived at the ranch. Margaret had been in town delivering mending to Mrs. Henderson when the sky turned the color of old bruises, purple-black and swollen with menace. The wind picked up so suddenly that her skirts whipped around her legs like living things, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in as many minutes. She'd barely made it back to the wagon when the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Within minutes, it had become a deluge. The road back to the ranch turned into a river of mud, and Clover struggled through it, her hooves slipping and sliding with each step. Margaret could barely see past the horse's ears through the sheets of rain that hammered down with punishing force. By the time she reached the ranch, she was soaked to the bone despite her oilcloth coat. She drove the wagon straight into the barn and jumped down, already scanning for Caleb. The cattle were nowhere to be seen, which meant they'd scattered to find shelter. The chickens had retreated into their coop. But where was Caleb? She heard a crash from the direction of the north pasture and took off running, rain stinging her face like needles. Through the gray curtain of water, she could make out movement near the fence line. Caleb was there, wrestling with something large and dark. As she got closer, she realized it was the old oak tree that stood at the property's northern boundary. Lightning must have struck it because half the trunk was blackened and smoking despite the rain, and a massive branch had fallen directly onto the fence, crushing 20 feet of posts and wire. But that wasn't the worst of it. 3 of their cattle were trapped on the wrong side of the break, and beyond them, past the ruined fence, lay Sam Pritchard's land. If those cattle wandered onto Pritchard's property, he could legally claim them as compensation for trespass. 3 head represented $30 they desperately needed. Caleb was already trying to herd the confused animals back through the gap, but the storm had them spooked. They kept breaking away, trying to run in different directions. Rain plastered his hair to his skull and his clothes to his body, but he kept moving, kept trying, his voice hoarse from shouting over the wind. Margaret didn't hesitate. She grabbed a length of rope from the ruined fence and joined him, using it to create a makeshift guide. Together, they formed a human corridor, pushing the cattle back toward the gap. It was brutal work. The animals were wild-eyed with fear, and more than once Margaret was nearly trampled as they surged past her. Lightning cracked across the sky, so close she felt the hair on her arms stand up. The thunder that followed was deafening. One of the cows bolted, breaking past Caleb's outstretched arms and heading straight for Pritchard's land. "I've got it," Caleb shouted, taking off after the runaway. Margaret focused on the 2 remaining cattle, herding them through the gap and back onto their own property. She secured them quickly with a temporary gate made from salvaged wire and fallen branches, then turned to help Caleb. He'd caught up with the runaway cow, but had gotten himself into trouble doing it. The animal had cornered itself in a rocky ravine, and Caleb was trying to approach it carefully, one hand extended, his voice low and soothing despite the howling wind. But the ground beneath him was slick with mud and rain, and as Margaret watched in horror, his foot slipped. He went down hard, sliding several feet before catching himself on an outcropping of rock. The cow, further panicked, charged past him and back toward their property. But Caleb wasn't getting up. Margaret scrambled down the ravine, her boots sliding in the mud. When she reached him, she saw blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, mixing with the rain to paint his face in pink rivulets. "Can you stand?" she shouted over the storm. "I think so." But when he tried to rise, he gasped and clutched his left side. "Ribs! Something's wrong!" Margaret got under his right arm, taking as much of his weight as she could. Together they climbed out of the ravine, every step in agony. The wind tried to knock them down, the rain tried to blind them, but they kept moving inch by painful inch until they finally made it back to the barn. Inside, out of the worst of the weather, Margaret helped Caleb sit on a hay bale. His face was gray with pain, and he was breathing in short, shallow gasps that told her something was definitely broken or badly bruised. "Stay here," she ordered. "I need to check the animals and secure the barn." She worked quickly, moving through the familiar routine despite her exhaustion and growing fear. The cattle were accounted for. The horses were safe in their stalls. The chickens were huddled in their coop. The barn itself was holding together, though she could hear the wind testing every board and shingle. When she returned to Caleb, he was still sitting exactly where she'd left him, one hand pressed against his ribs. The gash on his forehead had stopped bleeding, but it would need cleaning and probably stitches. "Can you make it to the house?" she asked. "Give me a minute." His voice was tight with pain. They waited while the storm raged outside, the barn creaking and groaning around them. When Caleb finally nodded, Margaret helped him stand and they made their way across the muddy yard to the house. Every step was a struggle, and by the time they got inside, they were both shaking from cold and exertion. Margaret sat Caleb at the kitchen table and immediately stoked up the fire until it was roaring. Then she heated water and gathered what medical supplies she had: clean cloths, whiskey for disinfecting, needle and thread for stitching. "Take off your shirt," she said, all business. Caleb tried to comply, but the movement made him wince and stop. Margaret had to help him, carefully peeling the wet fabric away from his skin. What she saw made her stomach clench. His left side was already turning purple with bruising, and when she gently probed the area, she could feel something wrong beneath the skin. "At least one broken rib, maybe two," she said. "I'll need to wrap it, and that cut on your head needs stitches." "I've had worse," but his voice lacked conviction. Margaret cleaned the head wound first, working as gently as she could, while Caleb sat rigid with pain. The gash was deep but clean, and she threaded her needle with steady hands despite the fear churning in her stomach. She'd done this before, stitched up Thomas after various ranch accidents, sewn up her own hand once after a knife slipped while she was butchering a chicken. But this felt different, more urgent, more important. She worked by lamplight while the storm battered the house, her stitches small and neat. Caleb didn't make a sound, though she could see his jaw clenched tight and a muscle jumping in his cheek. When she finished and tied off the thread, she poured a small amount of whiskey over the wound and then handed him the bottle. "Drink, for the pain." He took a long swallow, then another. Some color began returning to his face. Next came the ribs. Margaret tore up an old sheet to make bandages and wrapped his torso tightly, providing support and compression. Her hands shook slightly as she worked, though whether from cold or fear or something else entirely, she couldn't say. She was acutely aware of the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers, the rise and fall of his breathing, the trust implicit in the way he sat still and let her tend to him. When she finished, she stepped back. "You need rest, real rest. No work for at least a few days." "Can't afford a few days." But even as he said it, she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "We can't afford for you to make it worse either. Broken ribs take time to heal. If you puncture a lung—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The thought of Caleb dying, of being alone again, was suddenly unbearable. "Margaret." His hand caught hers, his grip weak but steady. "I'm all right, or I will be. Thank you for patching me up." She looked at their joined hands, his calloused and strong despite the injury, hers smaller but equally work-worn. When had this stopped being just a business arrangement? When had she started to care whether this man lived or died beyond the purely practical concern of losing her only help? She pulled her hand away gently. "Get to bed. I'll bring you something to eat once you're settled." He didn't argue, which told her how much pain he was really in. She helped him to his room and made sure he was situated before returning to the kitchen. Only then did she allow herself to sink into a chair and let the shaking take over. She'd come so close to losing him today, so close to being alone again, and the realization of how much that would have devastated her was almost overwhelming. The storm raged through the night, and Margaret checked on Caleb every few hours. He slept fitfully, his breathing labored, his face drawn with pain even in sleep. She sat beside his bed in the darkness, listening to him breathe, and acknowledged the truth she'd been avoiding for weeks. She cared about him, not just as a business partner or a hired hand or even as the husband he was on paper. She cared about him as a person, his quiet strength, his steady presence, his unwavering commitment to keeping his word. He'd worked himself to exhaustion for her ranch, for their future. He'd risked his life in that storm to save 3 cattle that might mean the difference between survival and foreclosure. And she had no idea if he felt anything beyond obligation and gratitude in return. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and gleaming with water. The damage was extensive. The fallen oak tree was still sprawled across the north fence. Branches and debris littered the yard. The chicken coop had lost part of its roof, but miraculously, the barn and house had survived intact, and all the animals were accounted for. Margaret assessed the damage alone, letting Caleb rest. The fence would take days to repair properly, and they didn't have days. They had 11 days until the bank payment was due, and they were still $63 short. She was standing in the muddy yard trying to figure out where to start when she heard a wagon approaching. She turned to see Pastor Matthews and his wife Ruth pulling up. followed by 3 more wagons carrying familiar faces from town. "Heard about the storm," Pastor Matthews called as he climbed down. "Figured you might need help with cleanup and repairs." Margaret stared at them, overwhelmed. Owen Davies, the blacksmith, was there, along with 2 of his apprentices. Mrs. Henderson had brought her sons. Even Martin Palmer from the general store had come, though he looked uncomfortable about it. "We can't pay," Margaret started. "Nobody's asking for payment," Owen interrupted gruffly. "You and your husband have been working yourselves to death trying to save this place. Least we can do is give you a hand when trouble hits." They spread out across the property, each person taking on a task without being asked. The men tackled the fallen tree and the ruined fence. Mrs. Henderson and Ruth worked on the chicken coop roof. The younger boys cleared debris from the yard. And Margaret, moved beyond words, coordinated the efforts and provided what tools and materials she could. Caleb appeared around mid-morning, moving stiffly and clearly in pain but determined to help. Margaret tried to send him back to bed, but he refused. "I can at least direct traffic and hand people tools," he said. "I won't do any heavy lifting, I promise." They worked through the day, and by evening the worst of the damage was repaired. The fence was standing again, reinforced even stronger than before. The chicken coop had a new roof. The yard was cleared of debris. What would have taken Margaret and Caleb a week or more had been accomplished in a single day. As the volunteers prepared to leave, Pastor Matthews pulled Margaret aside. "The town's been watching you 2, he said quietly, "watching you work and struggle and fight for this place. Some folks thought you were crazy for marrying a stranger. Some thought he was taking advantage of you." He paused. "But you've proven them wrong. You've shown everyone what real partnership looks like, what commitment means. And that's worth something, Margaret. That's worth a lot." After they left, Margaret and Caleb stood in the yard as the sun set behind the western hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. They were both exhausted, filthy, and still had an impossible mountain to climb. But they weren't climbing it alone anymore. "That was unexpected," Caleb said. It was. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. "I didn't think anyone cared whether we succeeded or failed. People care more than they let on. They just needed to see that we were serious, that we weren't giving up." He looked at her, his dark eyes reflecting the sunset. "Are we giving up?" "No, never." The word came out fierce, final. "We're going to save this ranch, Caleb, whatever it takes." He smiled, and despite the bruises and the bandage on his forehead and the careful way he held his injured side, it was a real smile, full of warmth and determination and something else she couldn't quite name. "Then let's count the money and see where we stand." Inside, they emptied the mason jar onto the kitchen table. The volunteers had left without fanfare, but several of them had forgotten coins on the porch or tucked into Margaret's hand with mumbled excuses. When they counted everything, including the payment Margaret had received from Mrs. Henderson that morning for the completed mending, they had $147. "63 to go," Caleb said. 11 days to earn it. That's about $6 a day. It was still an enormous amount, but somehow it felt achievable now in a way it hadn't before. They'd proven they could work miracles when they had to. They'd survived the storm. They'd saved the cattle. They'd earned the respect and help of their neighbors. They could do this. Over the next few days, Caleb healed slowly, while Margaret took on as much of the physical work as she could manage. He insisted on helping despite his injury, so she gave him tasks he could do while sitting or standing still, mending tack, sharpening tools, planning improvements for when they had time and money. But mostly, she tried to keep him rested so his ribs could heal properly. She also spent more time in town, taking on every job she could find. She cleaned houses, mended clothes, even helped at the general store when Palmer needed someone to mind the counter. Every penny went into the jar. Caleb, despite his injury, convinced Owen Davies to let him do lighter work at the blacksmith shop, manning the bellows, organizing supplies, handling the accounting that Owen had been neglecting. It wasn't as well paid as forge work, but it was something. They fell into a new routine, one that involved less physical labor from Caleb and more creative problem solving. He started taking on bookkeeping for other businesses in town, simple accounting that he could do in the evenings by lamplight. Margaret discovered she could earn money teaching the younger children basic reading and arithmetic on Saturday mornings. Every stream of income, no matter how small, mattered. 8 days before the bank payment was due, they counted the jar again and found they had $171. 43 to go. Margaret allowed herself a moment of hope. They might actually make it. But the next morning brought a setback. 2 of their remaining cattle came down sick with something that made them lethargic and feverish. Margaret recognized the symptoms immediately: shipping fever, probably caught from one of the cattle they'd bought cheap last fall. It wasn't usually fatal if caught early, but it required medicine they couldn't afford and care they didn't have time to provide. She stood in the barn looking at the sick animals and felt despair threaten to swallow her whole. If these cattle died, that was $20 of potential income gone. If the illness spread to the rest of the herd, it could wipe out everything they'd worked for. "What do we need?" Caleb asked from behind her. He'd followed her to the barn despite her attempts to let him rest. "Medicine, nursing care, time we don't have, and money we can't spare." Margaret's voice cracked. "We're so close, Caleb, so close. And now this." He was quiet for a moment, thinking, what if we didn't sell these cattle? What if we kept them, nursed them back to health, and found another way to make up the difference? What other way? We've sold everything we can spare. We're working every job available. There's nothing left. "There's the timber," Caleb said slowly. Margaret turned to look at him. "What timber?" "I've been surveying the property during my recovery, making notes about resources and opportunities. You have maybe 2 acres of good timber on the eastern boundary. Oak, walnut, some ash, quality hardwood. A lumber mill in Lincoln would pay good money for it. But that timber has been there for decades. Thomas always said it was too valuable to cut, that we should save it for emergencies." "What bigger emergency than losing everything?" Caleb met her eyes. "We cut carefully, selectively. Take the mature trees, leave the younger ones to grow. It's sustainable, and it would give us the money we need." Margaret thought about the timber, tall trees that had stood on the property longer than she'd been alive. Thomas had loved walking among them, said they gave him peace. The idea of cutting them down felt like a betrayal somehow. But keeping this ranch was what Thomas would have wanted. Saving their home mattered more than sentiment. "How much could we get?" "If we cut and haul about 15 trees, mill-quality logs, I'd estimate $50 to $60. Maybe more depending on the quality. It would be enough. Combined with what they already had and what they could still earn, it would be enough." "All right," Margaret said. "We do it. But we need to work fast. Can you handle it with your ribs?" "I'll direct. We'll hire a couple of men with strong backs to do the actual cutting and hauling. It'll cost us some of the profit, but we'll still come out ahead." They spent that afternoon riding the eastern boundary, marking trees for harvest. Caleb had a good eye for it, choosing mature trees that would yield quality lumber while leaving enough standing to preserve the integrity of the small forest. By evening, they had a plan. The next morning, Caleb hired 2 brothers from town, young men who'd been working as ranch hands and were happy for a few days' work at decent pay. Margaret negotiated with a freight hauler to transport the logs to Lincoln, and together they set the operation in motion. For 3 days, the sound of axes and saws echoed across the property. Margaret divided her time between nursing the sick cattle, managing the regular ranch work, and keeping track of the timber operation. Caleb supervised the cutting despite his injury, making sure each tree was felled safely and the logs were prepared properly for transport. It was brutal, exhausting work, but they pushed through. The sick cattle began to improve with round-the-clock care. The timber operation proceeded without major accidents. And slowly, tree by tree, log by log, they built their salvation out of wood and sweat and sheer determination. 5 days before the bank payment was due, the last of the logs rolled away on the freight wagon, headed for the mill in Lincoln. The hauler had paid them $30 as a deposit, with the remaining payment due when the mill accepted the logs. If everything went well, they'd have the full payment in 3 days. Margaret stood with Caleb in the eastern timber, looking at the stumps where the great trees had stood. It looked wrong somehow, like missing teeth in a smile. But new growth would eventually fill in the gaps, and the remaining trees had more room to spread now. "Thomas would understand," Caleb said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "I hope so." Margaret touched one of the stumps, feeling the rough texture of the cut wood. I hope we didn't make a mistake. We didn't. We did what we had to do to survive. That's not a mistake. That's just life. They walked back to the house in companionable silence. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table and counted their money one more time. $171 in the jar, $30 deposited with the freight hauler, and another estimated $30 to $40 due when the logs were accepted, plus whatever they could earn in the next 5 days. "We're going to make it," Margaret said, and for the first time she truly believed it. "We are." Caleb leaned back in his chair, wincing slightly as his ribs reminded him they weren't fully healed. "Margaret, I need to tell you something." The seriousness in his tone made her look up. "What is it?" "When I answered your advertisement, I was at the end of everything. I had maybe $5 to my name and nowhere to go. I'd been drifting for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to belong anywhere. I accepted your offer because I had nothing to lose." He paused, choosing his words carefully. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being about survival. This place, this ranch, this life we're building. It became home. You became... He stopped, shook his head. "I don't have pretty words for it. But I want you to know that I'm not here out of obligation anymore. I'm here because I want to be, because this is where I belong." Margaret felt her heart hammer against her ribs. The kitchen was warm from the stove, but she suddenly felt overheated, her face flushing. She'd been so focused on survival, on saving the ranch, that she'd been ignoring the feelings growing inside her. The way her day felt incomplete until she saw Caleb's face, the way her chest tightened when he smiled, the way she'd been terrified during the storm, not of losing help, but of losing him. "I'm glad you're here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm glad you answered the advertisement. I'm glad you stayed." They looked at each other across the table, the lamplight flickering between them, and something fundamental shifted. The business arrangement had become a partnership. The partnership had become something deeper. Neither of them said the word love. It was too soon, too complicated, too frightening, but it hung in the air between them, unspoken, but understood. The moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. Margaret rose to answer it, slightly annoyed at the interruption, but also grateful for the chance to compose herself. Sam Pritchard stood on her porch, hat in hand, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "Mr. Pritchard, this is unexpected." "Mrs. Ward, I apologize for the late hour, but I wanted to speak with you about a matter of some urgency." He glanced past her at Caleb, who'd risen from the table and now stood in the kitchen doorway. "Perhaps in private?" "Anything you have to say to me can be said in front of my husband," Margaret said firmly. Pritchard's jaw tightened slightly, but he nodded. "Very well. I've come to make one final offer for your property. I'm prepared to pay $250 cash immediate transaction. That would cover your bank debt with some left over to help you relocate." Margaret felt cold despite the warmth from the house. "How do you know about my bank debt?" "It's a small town, Mrs. Ward. People talk. The point is, I'm offering you a way out. Take the money, pay off the bank, and start fresh somewhere else without all this struggle." "The ranch isn't for sale," Margaret said flatly. "I've told you that before." "Be reasonable. You're days away from foreclosure. Even if you make this payment, you'll just be putting off the inevitable. This place has been failing for 2 years. One lucky break doesn't change the fundamentals." He looked directly at Caleb. "And no offense to your husband, but one man, especially one who arrived with nothing, can't turn around a sinking ship." Caleb stepped forward, moving to stand beside Margaret. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried an edge of steel. "Mr. Pritchard, my wife has given you her answer. Multiple times, it seems. The ranch isn't for sale. Not to you, not to anyone. We'll make our bank payment, and we'll keep making them. This land is ours, and we're not giving it up." Pritchard's expression hardened. "You're making a mistake, both of you. When this place fails, and it will fail, don't come crying to me for help." "We won't," Margaret said. "Good night, Mr. Pritchard." She closed the door in his face and leaned against it, her heart pounding. Through the window, she watched Pritchard climb into his expensive buggy and drive away, the wheels kicking up dust in the darkness. "He knows about the bank payment," she said, "which means he's probably been talking to someone at the bank, probably waiting for us to fail so he can swoop in at the foreclosure auction." "Then we'll just have to disappoint him." Caleb moved back to the table and sat down. his expression thoughtful. Although I wonder why he's so eager to get this particular piece of land. He already owns twice as much property. What makes this ranch so special? It was a good question, one Margaret had wondered herself, but she was too exhausted to puzzle it out tonight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Tonight, she just wanted to rest and hold on to the fragile hope they'd built. The next 3 days passed in a blur of anxiety and activity. The freight hauler sent word that the mill had accepted the logs and the full payment would be delivered by Friday morning, the day before the bank payment was due. Margaret spent her time finishing up every scrap of paying work she could find, while Caleb continued his bookkeeping jobs in the evenings. They worked like people possessed, driven by the knowledge that they were so close to their goal. Friday morning dawned clear and cold. Margaret was up before the sun, too nervous to sleep. She made coffee and paced the kitchen, watching the eastern horizon gradually lighten from black to gray to pale gold. The freight hauler was supposed to arrive by mid-morning with the payment from the mill. If he didn't come, if something had gone wrong with the timber sale, they'd fall short. All their work, all their sacrifice, would be for nothing. Caleb found her standing at the window, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that had long since gone cold. "He'll come," Caleb said quietly. "You don't know that. I know that we've done everything we can. The rest is out of our hands." He took the cold coffee from her and poured her a fresh cup. "Come eat something. Worrying on an empty stomach won't help anything." They choked down breakfast neither of them wanted, then found busy work to keep their hands occupied while they waited. Margaret reorganized the pantry for the third time that week. Caleb sharpened every tool in the barn until they could split hairs, and still the freight hauler didn't come. 10 o'clock passed, then 11. By noon, Margaret was ready to climb out of her skin with anxiety. Had there been an accident? Had the mill rejected the logs after all? Had the freight hauler simply taken their money and run? At noon, they finally heard the rattle of wagon wheels approaching. Margaret and Caleb practically ran to the yard, and there was the freight hauler grinning from his seat. "Sorry for the delay, folks. Had some trouble with a wheel bearing outside of town. But I've got your payment right here." He climbed down and pulled an envelope from his coat. The mill was mighty pleased with the quality of that lumber, paid top dollar for it. Margaret's hand shook as she opened the envelope and counted the bills inside. $45. More than they'd hoped for. Combined with what they already had and what they'd earned over the past few days, it would be enough. More than enough. She looked at Caleb, and the relief and joy in his expression probably mirrored her own. They'd done it. Against all odds, despite every setback and obstacle, they'd done it. That evening, they counted their money one final time. $273. They needed $300 for the bank, but they had one more day to make up the difference. Margaret had teaching scheduled for Saturday morning, which would bring in $3. Caleb had agreed to help Owen at the blacksmith shop, another $2, and they had a few items they could sell, some tools they'd been holding on to, some household goods they could spare. Together, it would be enough. "We should celebrate," Caleb said, looking at the pile of money on the table. "This is a victory worth marking." Margaret realized he was right. They'd been so focused on the goal that they hadn't stopped to appreciate what they'd accomplished. In just over a month, they'd earned enough money to save the ranch. They'd turned a failing property into something viable. They'd built a partnership out of desperation and made it into something real and valuable. She pulled out a bottle of whiskey she'd been saving, bought back when Thomas was alive, meant for special occasions. This qualified. She poured 2 small glasses and handed one to Caleb. "To survival," she said, raising her glass. "To home," Caleb countered, touching his glass to hers. They drank, the whiskey burning warm down Margaret's throat. And then, because she was feeling brave and relieved and something else she didn't want to examine too closely, she set down her glass and did something she'd been wanting to do for weeks. She kissed him. It was brief, tentative, barely more than a brush of lips. But it was enough to send her heart racing and make her face flush hot. She pulled back, suddenly mortified. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have..." Caleb's hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing across her skin. "Don't apologize." His voice was rough. "I've been wanting to do that since about the second week I was here, but I didn't know if you wanted... If this was just... It's not just anything anymore," Margaret said, her hand covering his where it rested against her face. "I don't know exactly what it is, but it's not just a business arrangement. Not for me." "Not for me either." He leaned forward and kissed her properly this time, his lips warm and sure against hers. It was everything their first kiss in the pastor's parlor hadn't been, real and wanted and full of unspoken promise. When they finally pulled apart, Margaret rested her forehead against his, breathing hard. "We should probably figure out what this means, what we are to each other." "Later," Caleb said, smiling. "Right now, let's just be grateful we made it this far. Tomorrow we'll pay off the bank. The day after that, we'll figure out the rest." Margaret woke the next morning with a sense of anticipation so strong it felt like electricity in her veins. Today was the day. After weeks of backbreaking work, after selling everything they could spare, after countless hours of worry and fear, they would finally walk into that bank and make their payment. They would save the ranch. She dressed carefully in her best clothes, the blue dress she'd worn to her wedding, freshly pressed. She pinned her hair up with extra care and even dabbed a bit of rose water on her wrists, something she hadn't done in months. When she emerged from her room, she found Caleb already in the kitchen, similarly dressed in his cleanest shirt and trousers. He'd even trimmed his hair, though the job was slightly uneven, clearly done by his own hand with a dull pair of scissors. "You look nice," he said, his eyes warming as they took her in. "So do you." Margaret felt herself blushing and turned away to pour coffee. Last night's kiss hung between them, unacknowledged but present in every glance and movement. They'd opened a door neither of them was quite sure how to walk through yet. They ate a quiet breakfast, both too nervous to make much conversation. After they cleaned up, Margaret went to the shelf where they'd been keeping the mason jar. She upended it on the table, and they counted the money one final time. $273. They needed 27 more. "Teaching money from this morning," Margaret said, checking her list. "That's $3. Your work at the blacksmith shop, 2 more, and I have these items we can sell." She gestured to a small pile on the counter, some tools, a silver picture frame, a wool blanket they could spare. "The blanket alone should fetch $5, Caleb said. "The tools another 3. We'll have enough." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest. They would have enough. After everything, despite all the obstacles, they were going to make it. She spent the morning teaching reading to 6 children whose parents worked in town and needed someone to mind them on Saturday. The children were restless and distracted by the spring weather outside, but Margaret got them through their lessons and collected her $3 with gratitude. Meanwhile, Caleb worked at the blacksmith shop, helping Owen complete a rush order for a farmer who needed his plow repaired before planting season. By early afternoon, they'd met back at the ranch and made the rounds to sell their remaining items. The blanket went to Mrs. Henderson for $5. Martin Palmer bought the tools for $3.50, seeming almost apologetic as he handed over the money. By the time they finished, they had $306.50. They had done it. They had actually done it. Margaret stood in the ranch yard, holding the envelope full of money, and felt tears prick her eyes. For the first time in 2 years, she could breathe without the crushing weight of imminent failure pressing down on her chest. The ranch was safe. Her home was safe. Everything Thomas had worked for, everything she'd fought to preserve, was secure. "Ready?" Caleb asked, offering his arm. She took it, feeling the solid strength of him beside her. "Ready." They rode into Red Creek together in the wagon, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders despite the lingering chill in the air. Spring was coming. Margaret could see it in the green shoots pushing up through the soil, in the way the light had changed, in the birds that had begun to return from their winter territories. Spring meant renewal, new growth, fresh starts. It felt fitting somehow. The bank was located on Main Street, a solid brick building that had always seemed vaguely threatening to Margaret. She'd avoided it as much as possible over the past months, each visit a reminder of her mounting debt and precarious situation. But today, she walked through the front door with her head held high, and her hand tucked into the crook of Caleb's arm. The interior was dim and cool, with a high ceiling and dark wood paneling that absorbed light. 3 teller windows lined one wall, and behind them sat Harold Winters, the bank manager. He was a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles and the permanently pursed expression of someone who found the entire world vaguely distasteful. He looked up as they approached, and Margaret watched his eyebrows climb toward his receding hairline. He'd probably expected never to see her again except at the foreclosure auction. "Mrs. Ellison, excuse me, Mrs. Ward," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "What can I do for you today?" "We're here to make our loan payment," Margaret said, setting the envelope on the counter between them. $300, as required. For a moment, Winters just stared at the envelope. Then he opened it and began counting the money with methodical precision, his thin fingers moving swiftly through the bills and coins. Margaret watched his expression shift from skepticism to surprise to something that might have been disappointment. When he finished counting, he looked up at them over his spectacles. "This is the full amount, plus $6.50 over. The extra is to be applied to next year's payment," Margaret said firmly. Winters hesitated, and Margaret could see him searching for some reason to reject the payment, some technicality he could invoke. But the money was all there, delivered on time, and there was nothing he could do. "Very well," he said finally. He pulled out a ledger and made a notation, his pen scratching across the page with clear reluctance. Then he wrote out a receipt and stamped it with an official-looking seal. "Your account is current, Mrs. Ward. The next payment is due in 12 months. Margaret took the receipt with hands that trembled slightly. It was done. Officially, legally done. The ranch was safe for another year, and by then, they'd be in a much stronger position. She'd have time to rebuild the herd, to make improvements, to strengthen their financial foundation. "Thank you, Mr. Winters," she said, unable to keep a note of triumph out of her voice. They turned to leave, but Winters's voice stopped them. "Mrs. Ward, if I may offer some advice, you've managed to scrape together this payment, but the underlying issues with your property remain. The ranch has been struggling for 2 years. One good month doesn't change the fundamentals. If you ever decide to sell, there are interested buyers who would offer fair prices." Margaret turned back to him, her expression hardening. "Mr. Winters, the ranch stopped struggling the day my husband arrived. We're not selling. Not to Sam Pritchard, not to anyone. You can tell him that if he asks." She had the satisfaction of seeing Winters' face flush slightly before she swept out of the bank, Caleb beside her. Once outside, the afternoon sunlight felt almost blinding after the dim interior. Margaret stopped on the boardwalk, breathing hard, her heart racing with a mixture of relief and anger. "He's been talking to Pritchard," she said, "the bank manager. That's how Pritchard knew about the payment deadline. Winters probably expected us to fail so Pritchard could buy the property cheap at auction." "Probably," Caleb agreed, "but we didn't fail. And now they know we're not going anywhere." Margaret looked at the receipt in her hand, at the official stamp that declared their account current, and felt a fierce satisfaction. They'd beaten the odds. They'd proven everyone wrong, the neighbors who'd whispered about her desperate marriage, the businessmen who'd expected her to fold, the vultures who'd been circling waiting for her to fail. "We should celebrate," she said suddenly. "Really celebrate. Dinner at the hotel dining room." Caleb looked surprised. "Margaret, we just scraped together every penny we had. Can we afford—" "We have $6.50 more than we needed," Margaret interrupted. "And we've been living on salt pork and beans for weeks. I want a real meal, Caleb. I want to sit in that dining room where everyone can see us and eat a proper dinner like people who aren't about to lose everything, because we're not. We won." A slow smile spread across Caleb's face. "Then let's celebrate." The Red Creek Hotel wasn't fancy by any measure, but its dining room was the nicest place in town to eat. White tablecloths, actual china plates, food that didn't come from a tin. As they entered, Margaret felt every eye in the room turn toward them. She recognized most of the diners, townspeople, a few traveling salesmen, Mrs. Henderson sitting with Pastor Matthews and his wife. The hostess, a woman named Clara who'd known Margaret since childhood, showed them to a table with barely concealed surprise. "Mrs. Ward! Mr. Ward! I didn't expect to see you here today." "We're celebrating," Margaret said, settling into her chair with as much dignity as she could muster. "What would you recommend?" They ordered roast chicken with vegetables and fresh bread, plus coffee and a slice of apple pie to share. As they waited for their food, Margaret became aware of the whispers circulating through the room. She caught fragments of conversation from nearby tables, made the payment, surprised everyone, that husband of hers, working themselves half to death. Let them talk. She'd given them plenty to gossip about over the past month. At least now the story had a happy ending. Their food arrived, and for several minutes, Margaret focused on nothing but the pleasure of eating something that wasn't beans or cornmeal mush. The chicken was tender and perfectly seasoned. The vegetables were fresh, not canned or preserved. The bread was still warm from the oven. It was the best meal she'd had in months, maybe years. Across from her, Caleb ate with the same quiet appreciation, though she noticed he kept glancing at her with a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "What?" she asked finally. "You look happy," he said simply. "Really happy. I don't think I've seen you like this before." Margaret realized he was right. For the first time since Thomas died, maybe even before that, she felt genuinely happy. Not just relieved or satisfied, but happy in a way that went bone deep. She'd faced impossible odds and overcome them. She'd built something real and valuable with this man who'd been a stranger just weeks ago. She had a future that wasn't defined by fear and desperation. "I am happy," she said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "We did it, Caleb. We actually did it." His fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. "We did. And now we get to figure out what comes next." They were finishing their pie when Sam Pritchard entered the dining room. He spotted them immediately, and Margaret watched his expression shift from surprise to calculation to poorly concealed anger. He started toward their table, and Margaret braced herself for another unpleasant confrontation. But before Pritchard could reach them, Owen Davies stood up from his table and intercepted him. Margaret couldn't hear what Owen said, but his body language was unmistakable. He was blocking Pritchard's path and making it clear the man wasn't welcome to approach. After a moment of tense silence, Pritchard turned on his heel and left the dining room, his face dark with fury. Owen caught Margaret's eye and gave her a small nod before returning to his own meal. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude. The town was on their side. They'd proven themselves, and people were standing with them now. As they left the hotel, full and satisfied, Margaret noticed the sun was beginning to set. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, and the air had that peculiar quality of spring evenings, cool but promising warmth to come. "Let's not go home just yet," Margaret said impulsively. "Let's walk a bit." They strolled down Main Street past the closed shops and quiet houses, their steps unhurried. For once there was no pressing work waiting, no immediate crisis demanding attention. They could simply be together, enjoying the evening and each other's company. "I need to tell you something," Margaret said as they walked. "When Thomas died, I thought my life was over. Not literally, but in every way that mattered. I thought I'd failed him, failed our dream of building something lasting. For 2 years, I was just surviving, getting from one day to the next without any real hope that things would improve." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "And then you arrived, and at first I thought you were just another problem to manage, another responsibility to shoulder. But you weren't. You were—" She struggled to find the right words. "You were exactly what I needed, even though I didn't know what that was. You gave me hope again. You made me believe we could fight and win. You made me feel like I wasn't alone." Caleb was quiet for a moment before responding. "When I got on that train to come here, I was broken, Margaret. Maybe not in ways people could see, but broken nonetheless. 15 years of drifting had hollowed me out. I'd forgotten what it felt like to care about something, to work for more than just the next meal and a place to sleep." He stopped walking and turned to face her. "You gave me purpose. You gave me a reason to stay and fight instead of running when things got hard. You trusted me when you had no reason to. And that trust, it changed me." They stood on the empty street as twilight deepened around them, the first stars beginning to appear overhead. Margaret felt something shift inside her, something falling into place like a key turning in a lock. "I love you," she said, the words escaping before she could second-guess them. "I didn't plan to. I didn't think I could. But I do. I love you, Caleb Ward." His smile was slow and warm, lighting up his entire face. "I love you too, Margaret. Have for weeks now, if I'm honest. Just didn't know how to say it." He kissed her there on Main Street, where anyone looking out their window could see. It was bold in public and completely unlike the careful propriety they'd maintained since his arrival. But Margaret didn't care. Let the whole town see. Let them talk. She was happy, she was in love, and she wasn't going to hide either of those things. When they finally made it back to the ranch, full darkness had fallen. The house looked welcoming, with lamplight glowing in the windows. Margaret had left a lamp burning before they left. They put the wagon away and tended to Clover, moving through the familiar evening chores with a new awareness of each other. Inside, Margaret lit more lamps while Caleb stoked the fire. The house felt different somehow, more like a home than just a place she lived. When Caleb came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, she leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his chest against her spine. "Stay with me tonight," she said quietly. "Not in the spare room, with me." She felt him tense slightly. "Margaret, are you sure? We don't have to rush anything. I'm not going anywhere." "I'm sure." She turned in his arms to face him. "We're married, Caleb. Really married now. Not just on paper. And I want this to be real in every way. If you want that too." "I do," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "God, Margaret, I do." They made their way to her bedroom, their bedroom now, with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation. It had been so long since Margaret had been with a man, and never with anyone but Thomas. But Caleb was patient and gentle, taking his time, making sure she was comfortable at every step. And when they finally came together, it felt right in a way that went beyond the physical. It felt like the final piece of their partnership clicking into place, the last barrier between them dissolving. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, Margaret's head on Caleb's chest, listening to his heartbeat gradually slow. His fingers traced lazy patterns on her bare shoulder, and she felt more at peace than she had in years. "We need to talk about the future," Caleb said eventually. "Really talk about it. What we want to do with the ranch, how we want to build our life together." Margaret propped herself up on one elbow to look at him. "What do you want?" "I want to make this place thrive, not just survive. I want to improve the herd, maybe add some crops. I was thinking we could plant wheat in the southern fields. The soil's good there, and with proper management, we could diversify our income." He paused. "And eventually, if you want, I'd like to have a family, children, but only if that's something you want too." The thought sent a flutter through Margaret's stomach, part fear, part excitement. She'd never had children with Thomas. They'd tried for years without success, and eventually they'd accepted it wasn't meant to be. But maybe with Caleb, things would be different. "I'd like that," she said softly. "All of it. Building this place up, making it something we can be proud of. And yes, children. A family." She smiled. "We're going to need a bigger house eventually. One step at a time," Caleb said, pulling her back down against his chest. "First, we get through the rest of winter and into spring. Then we can start planning for the future." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Margaret slept more soundly than she had in months. The next few weeks brought a gentler rhythm to their lives. With the immediate crisis past, they could focus on longer-term improvements rather than just desperate survival. Caleb drew up plans for expanding the barn and adding a proper workshop. Margaret started a kitchen garden, planting seeds for vegetables they could eat fresh rather than relying on preserved goods. Together, they worked on rebuilding the herd, carefully selecting which cattle to keep and which to sell to generate operating capital. Spring arrived in earnest, transforming the prairie from brown and dormant to green and alive. Wildflowers dotted the hillsides. Birds returned to nest in the barn rafters. The cattle grew fat on new grass, and the horses seemed to prance with the joy of milder weather. The ranch, which had looked so desolate and failing when Caleb first arrived, was beginning to bloom. But success brought its own challenges. As word spread that the Ellison Ranch had not only survived but was thriving, more people came around. Some offering genuine friendship, others looking to take advantage. Salesmen appeared selling everything from patent medicines to farm equipment. Neighbors who'd ignored Margaret for 2 years suddenly wanted to borrow tools or ask advice. And Sam Pritchard, rather than accepting defeat, seemed to grow more persistent in his interest in their property. One warm afternoon in late April, Margaret was hanging laundry when she saw a fancy buggy approaching. She didn't recognize the vehicle, but something about it made her uneasy. She called for Caleb, who was working on the new fence line, and together they waited as the buggy pulled into their yard. A well-dressed man climbed down, removing his hat to reveal silver hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Mrs. Ward? Mr. Ward. My name is Charles Blackwood. I'm a land agent from Lincoln. I wonder if I might have a few moments of your time. Margaret exchanged glances with Caleb. What's this about, Mr. Blackwood? I represent a consortium of investors interested in acquiring properties in this region. We've heard about your ranch and believe it would be an excellent addition to our portfolio. He pulled a document from his coat. We're prepared to offer you $4,000 for the property, including all buildings, livestock, and equipment. That's nearly twice what it's worth on the open market. Margaret felt her stomach drop. $4,000 was a fortune, more money than she'd ever dreamed of having. They could pay off every debt, buy a smaller property somewhere else, live comfortably for years. But this land wasn't just about money. It was her home. It was Thomas's legacy. It was everything she'd fought to preserve. The ranch isn't for sale, she said firmly. Blackwood's smile never wavered. Mrs. Ward, I understand attachment to one's property, but please consider the practical aspects. You've struggled for years to keep this place afloat. You've only just avoided foreclosure. Why continue that struggle when you could sell for a substantial profit and start fresh somewhere easier? Because this is our home, Caleb said, his voice hard. And we're not struggling anymore. We're thriving. So I suggest you get back in your fancy buggy and tell your investors they'll need to look elsewhere. Blackwood's expression finally shifted, becoming colder. I should mention that we're prepared to acquire this property one way or another. We have partnerships with the bank and several local creditors. If you won't sell voluntarily, we can make life very difficult for you. Is that a threat? Margaret asked, anger rising in her chest. It's simply a statement of fact. We always get the properties we want, Mrs. Ward. Always. You'd be wise to take the money and avoid future complications. Get off my property, Margaret said, her voice shaking with fury. Now! Blackwood studied them both for a long moment, then replaced his hat and climbed back into his buggy. You'll regret this decision. We'll be in touch. He drove away, leaving only dust and a sense of foreboding. Margaret turned to Caleb, her earlier happiness evaporating. What was that about? Why would investors from Lincoln care about our small ranch? I don't know, Caleb said slowly. But I intend to find out. There's something going on here, something bigger than we realize. Pritchard's been trying to buy this place for 2 years. Now a consortium from Lincoln? There's something about this land they want, something valuable enough to threaten us over. Over the next few days, Caleb did research. He talked to other ranchers in the area, asked questions at the land office, dug through county records. What he discovered was troubling. The railroad, he told Margaret one evening as they sat at the kitchen table. There are plans, still unofficial but pretty certain, to run a new rail line through this area within the next 2 years. Any property along the proposed route will increase in value tenfold, maybe more. Towns will spring up along the line, commerce will boom, and our ranch sits right in the middle of the most likely route. Margaret stared at him, trying to process the implications. So Pritchard knew. He's been trying to buy the property cheap before the news became public. And now these investors know too. They want to acquire as much land as possible before the railroad announces officially and prices skyrocket. Exactly. If we hold on to this land, we could be sitting on a gold mine. We could sell portions to the railroad, lease land to new businesses, maybe even start a town of our own on the property. Caleb paused. But it also means we're standing in the way of some very powerful, very wealthy people who don't like being told no. The weight of this settled over Margaret like a physical thing. They'd worked so hard just to survive, to save the ranch from foreclosure. Now they had to defend it against people with far more resources and far fewer scruples. What do we do? She asked. We stay, Caleb said firmly. We hold our ground. We document everything, every offer, every threat, every attempt to pressure us. We make sure everyone in Red Creek knows what's happening so these investors can't do anything underhanded without witnesses. And we prepare for a long fight because they're not going to give up easily. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. A month ago, she would have faced this threat alone, terrified and overwhelmed. But now she had Caleb beside her, and together they were stronger than she'd ever been by herself. Then we fight, she said. We've beaten impossible odds before. We can do it again. Over the following weeks, the pressure campaign began in earnest. Suddenly, getting credit at the general store became difficult. The feed supplier raised his prices without explanation. A fence was mysteriously cut in the night, letting cattle wander onto neighboring property. Small harassments designed to wear them down, to make them desperate enough to accept any offer just to end the struggle. But Margaret and Caleb refused to break. They paid cash when credit was denied. They found alternate suppliers when necessary. They rode fence every night to check for damage and repaired it immediately. They documented every incident and made sure Pastor Matthews, Owen Davies, and other trusted community members were aware of what was happening. The town began to take sides. Some people, those with business relationships with Pritchard or ties to the bank, started treating Margaret and Caleb coldly, but others rallied around them. Owen Davies spoke loudly in the saloon about unfair business practices. Mrs. Henderson made sure everyone at her boarding house heard about the pressure campaign. Pastor Matthews delivered a sermon about standing up to bullies and protecting the vulnerable. Red Creek was a small town, but it had a strong sense of community and justice. And the more Pritchard and his associates pushed, the more people pushed back. One evening, Margaret and Caleb returned from town to find someone waiting at their house. It was a young man in his early 20s, thin and nervous-looking, sitting on their porch steps. "Can we help you?" Margaret asked cautiously. The young man stood quickly, hat in hand. "Mrs. Ward, Mr. Ward, my name is Timothy Blake. I work as a clerk at Pritchard's ranch. I need to tell you something important." They invited him inside, and over coffee, Timothy told them everything. Pritchard had been meeting with Blackwood and the other investors. They were planning to drive Margaret and Caleb off the land through whatever means necessary, legal or otherwise. They'd discussed buying up all the mortgages and notes they could find to create financial pressure. They'd talked about bribing county officials to cite violations and find the ranch into bankruptcy. And if all that failed, there were darker suggestions about accidents and fires that would make the property unlivable. "I couldn't be part of it," Timothy said, his voice shaking. "My father worked for your late husband, Mrs. Ward. He always said Mr. Ellison was a fair man, an honest man. I won't help these people destroy what he built." He pulled out a sheaf of papers from his coat. "I made copies of everything, meeting notes, correspondence, financial records. It's all here, enough to prove what they're planning." Margaret took the papers with trembling hands. "Timothy, this could get you in serious trouble. If Pritchard finds out, I'm leaving Red Creek tonight. I have family in Denver who'll take me in, but I wanted you to have this first. Use it to protect yourselves. Show it to the sheriff, to a lawyer, to the newspaper if you need to. Just don't let them win." After Timothy left, Margaret and Caleb sat up late into the night, reading through the documents. The evidence was damning, clear proof of conspiracy, intimidation, and planned illegal activities. With this, they could go to the authorities and shut down Pritchard's schemes before they went any further. "We take this to the sheriff first thing tomorrow," Caleb said, "and then to a lawyer. We'll need legal protection, injunctions if possible." Margaret nodded, but she felt a bone-deep weariness settling over her. They'd saved the ranch from foreclosure, only to face an even bigger threat. When would it end? When would they finally be allowed to just live their lives in peace? As if reading her thoughts, Caleb pulled her close. "I know you're tired. I am too. But we're not giving up. We've come too far to quit now." "I know," Margaret said, leaning into his strength. I want to wake up one morning and not have to fight. I want to work the land and raise our family and grow old together without constantly looking over our shoulders for the next threat." "We will," Caleb promised. "We'll get through this, and then we'll have that peace, I swear it." Margaret wanted to believe him. And maybe, just maybe, with the evidence Timothy had given them and the support of their community, they actually could win this fight. They'd beaten impossible odds before. They could do it again. They had to. The sheriff's office occupied a small brick building at the end of Main Street, marked by a faded sign and iron bars on the windows. Margaret and Caleb arrived just after dawn, the documents Timothy had given them secured in a leather satchel. Sheriff Thomas Brennan was already at his desk, a cup of coffee steaming in front of him as he reviewed overnight reports. He looked up when they entered, his weathered face showing surprise. Brennan was in his late 50s, a former cavalry officer who'd taken the sheriff position after retiring from military service. He had a reputation for fairness, but Margaret also knew he played poker with Sam Pritchard every Thursday night. "Mrs. Ward, Mr. Ward, early visitors. What brings you in?" Margaret set the satchel on his desk. "We need to report a conspiracy, Sheriff, against our property and potentially against us personally." For the next hour, they laid it all out, the pressure campaign, the threats, the mysterious offers from Lincoln investors. Then they showed him Timothy's documents, watching his expression shift from skepticism to concern to anger as he read through the evidence. "This is serious," Brennan said finally, setting down the papers. "If these documents are authentic, and they appear to be, we're talking about criminal conspiracy, intimidation, potentially fraud. I'll need to investigate, bring in the county prosecutor." "How long will that take?" Caleb asked. "Weeks, maybe months. These things move slowly, especially when prominent citizens are involved." Brennan leaned back in his chair. "In the meantime, I can offer you protection, extra patrols past your property, documentation of any further incidents. But I need to warn you, fighting men like Pritchard and these Lincoln investors is dangerous. They have resources and connections I don't." "We're not backing down," Margaret said firmly. "That ranch is our home. We've fought too hard to keep it just to hand it over to greedy men who want to profit from our struggle." Brennan nodded slowly. "I respect that, and I'll do everything in my power to help. But watch yourselves. Desperate men do desperate things." They left the sheriff's office feeling both relieved and anxious. They'd taken the first step toward legal protection, but as Brennan had warned, the wheels of justice turned slowly. In the meantime, they'd remain vulnerable to whatever Pritchard and his associates might try. Their next stop was the office of Benjamin Hartwell, Red Creek's only lawyer. Hartwell was a young man, barely 30, who'd come west from Boston 3 years earlier seeking adventure and opportunity. He practiced law out of a small office above the general store, handling everything from property disputes to wills to the occasional criminal defense. He listened to their story with growing interest, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. When they finished and showed him the documents, he let out a low whistle. "This is explosive material. Pritchard has been operating in this county for 20 years, building relationships, establishing himself as a pillar of the community. These documents show him for what he really is, a ruthless profiteer willing to break laws to get what he wants." Hartwell tapped the papers thoughtfully. "With this evidence, I can file for restraining orders, demand investigations, make enough legal noise that they'll have to back off or risk serious criminal charges." "What will it cost?" Margaret asked, already dreading the answer. Legal fees could devastate their finances just as thoroughly as foreclosure. "Normally, I'd charge $50 just for consultation on a case like this, but—" Hartwell smiled. "I've been looking for a case that would make my reputation, establish me as more than just a small-town paper pusher. This is that case. I'll take it for 20% of any damages we recover, plus you cover filing fees and expenses. If we don't recover anything, you pay nothing beyond expenses." It was more generous than Margaret had hoped. She and Caleb agreed immediately, and Hartwell began drawing up the necessary legal documents. By the time they left his office, the sun was high overhead, and they both felt cautiously optimistic. They had the law on their side now. They weren't fighting alone anymore, but their optimism was short-lived. As they walked toward their wagon, Margaret noticed a crowd gathering near the general store. She could hear raised voices, anger in the tone. When they got closer, she saw Martin Palmer standing on the boardwalk, reading from a newspaper. "Says here that the territorial legislature is considering new property laws.